A few months ago, I bought a Dell Prebuilt XPS 8940. And in that Dell Prebuilt, it had a 10700, a 3060 Ti, and 16 gigabytes of RAM. So earlier today, I was playing around with just random sets of RAM that I have laying around. And I remembered that Linus had just made a video talking something to do with RAM. Like I saw some people posting about it, but I didn't actually watch the video. I remember that he made the video, so I went and watched it. And he talked about how X16 RAM is much slower than other consumer RAM, but he was kind of focused in on laptops. He did mention that desktops could have a performance hit from this, and I just want to say that he is 100% correct. So the RAM that I pulled out of my XPS 8940 is, it's 3200 megahertz, CL22, but it is also X16, or more precisely 1R-X16, and you can tell it only has 4 memory modules mounted to the RAM stick. There's nothing on the back. The more interesting thing is say you have a set of Corsair RAM like this Corsair Vengeance. It is also 3200 megahertz, although it is CL16, but it is 16GX4, so I can only imagine it has quite a bit more. In fact, let me just pull the heat spreaders off. So once you pull the heat spreaders off, it has twice as many memory modules mounted to the individual RAM sticks. So if you think about it, it's more like organizing your stuff in like Tupperware. You have, this here, this here, this here, this here. If you only had 4 giant bins, if you're trying to find something, you're just rapidly searching through it, and it's less efficient as storing and checking 8 smaller boxes instead of 4 larger boxes. It's easier to just kind of sift through the top than having to dig down into it, and that's really the concept behind multiple memory modules on your single sticks of RAM. So let's go ahead and take a look at just how bad this RAM performs compared to that Corsair Vengeance. Remember guys, they're both 3200 megahertz kits, but I'm gonna pull a bit of a party trick and just run this out of the box and then run that without even enabling XMP. So 2133, I think it's CL15, but it is a much lower megahertz rating. So here we have an Intel i9 10850K with a Radeon 5700 XT, and we're gonna run Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 720p just to kind of max out the CPU bottleneck and really strain the RAM. I want it to be asking the RAM for as much as possible. So if we go into the BIOS, sorry about mine being green, you'll see that the system memory multiplier right here is auto, and it's set to 3200 megahertz, and there is no option for XMP. Usually there would be an XMP option right here. There is none. But once we get into Windows, we'll go ahead and open up CPU ID to see what it is running at just right after you plug it in. It's very interesting that you don't have to enable an XMP, because usually when you install any kind of RAM, it requires you to turn on an XMP, but this, it doesn't. It just runs at 3200 with awful timings. As you can see, we're running at 3200 megahertz. Obviously, DRAM frequency is double data rate, so it's twice whatever that number is up at the top. So we're running at 3200 megahertz, but we're running at CL22. That is awful RAM timings. And to make it even worse, it is on that X16 memory layout. So let's just go ahead and load Shadow of the Tomb Raider and see what kind of frame rates we get. So we're running 720p and all low. Again, I want this to be a CPU bottleneck, not a GPU bottleneck. So here we are with the Dell Prebuilt X16 RAM. We show an average of 152 FPS on a 10850K and a 5700 XT at 720p. I don't know about that. Let's go ahead and run it with the Corsair Vengeance, but non-XMP, so running just JEDEC standard DDR4 speeds, and see what kind of frame rates we get with that. Just boot into the BIOS real quick just to show you guys it is in fact running at completely stock speeds, or at least I want to make sure that it's running at completely stock speeds, because if you go from one RAM set to another, sometimes it'll carry over settings from the previous RAM, and I don't want that. I mean, clearly. So disabled, auto, auto, auto. Everything about this RAM is set up completely stock. So it should, in theory, be slower than that RAM. But I think we'll find out it's quite the opposite. Go ahead and open up CPU-Z just to show that it is in fact running completely stock. So as you can see, we're running at 1066, which is 2133, and then 15, 15, 15. So much tighter timings than the Dell RAM, but also a much lower DRAM frequency. Today, I'm only testing the Dell RAM versus the Corsair RAM, but I'm looking forward to coming out with a video where I compare some low-end RAM versus some better RAM versus the best DRAM that I have, so get subscribed for that. And there it is, 164 FPS. So we saw a jump of 10 FPS just from swapping out the Dell RAM to Corsair RAM and not even turning on XMP. So let's see what happens when we turn on XMP. Let's just go straight down to the extreme memory profile, hit enter, profile 1, boom, F10, save, we're good to go. XMP is now enabled. That's all you have to do to enable your XMP, guys. So if your XMP is not enabled, go ahead and give it a shot. Now, I will warn you, sometimes you can get into a no-boot situation by turning on XMP on some earlier Ryzen, so be a little aware of that. If you have to, reset your BIOS and try it again with lower memory speeds. As you can see, we're running at 1600, which is 3200 megahertz. CL16, 18. Let's go ahead and run it again. Seriously, it amazes me just how bad this RAM is. Like, I tried overclocking it, and it barely wanted to overclock at all, and it yielded very minimal gains. It's also kind of interesting because in that Dell XPS 8940 that I have, this runs at 2933, so it runs even slower in that Dell. I think there might be a latency trade-off, like they might have a BIOS in the Dell that lowers the timings on this a little bit, but the X16 aspect of it is really what's killing it. And there it is, 188 FPS going from one set of RAM to another. We saw an increase of 30 FPS. That is massive. And it just goes to show how bad this Dell RAM really is. And if you think, Gabe, what about Ryzen? It's even worse. I was originally going to do this video with Ryzen, but I wanted to test it with Intel to make sure that I wasn't only getting Ryzen shenanigans going on. Go ahead and open up some pictures here. So on this exact same system with a 3600X running the Dell RAM, we saw 113 FPS. Then when I swapped it out for the Corsair RAM and ran it completely stock, we saw 126 FPS. And then turning on the XMP, we saw 137 FPS. So not quite as huge of a gain as we saw on this. I think it's because this CPU is faster. It can pull more from the RAM, so it can generate more of a bottleneck from the RAM. But this was just to show that this is not just a single platform issue. You will have problems with Ryzen or Intel when using this RAM. So like I said at the beginning, Linus was 100% right in showing this from the industry standpoint, that this is definitely something that manufacturers should disclose on whatever website, whatever advertising that they can, because if you're selling a Prebuilt and it's got 3200 megahertz RAM and you're selling one with better 3200 megahertz RAM, you might as well advertise that it is the better stuff, because this X16 crap is garbage. Having two sets of RAM that are both advertised at 3200 megahertz but perform wildly differently just causes people to lose faith in the industry as a whole. It's a very scummy tactic, and in the long term, it's only going to cause more confusion. Like I said before, I look forward to coming out with another video about just kind of like RAM price tiers to show you what kind of performance you'll get out of, say, X or Y amount of money that you spend on RAM. So get subscribed for that. Leave a comment about how you think the industry should deal with this whole RAM debacle, because obviously it doesn't look good for any single manufacturer using these kinds of marketing tactics. Hit that like button for me. I really appreciate it. And like always, I'll see you next time.